Hello, miss. Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Ah. Okay.
The Philippines, a country of 75 million people, the vast majority are Catholic. Signs of faith are everywhere, especially during Easter week, which commemorates the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In the village of San Pedro Catude, Rolando Ocampo is a local carpenter who has made an oath to God. 12 years ago, his wife was giving birth to their youngest daughter, Cindy, but there were complications, and both hovered near death. Rolando began to pray.
I told the Lord that if my wife would have a safe delivery, I would have myself crucified on Good Friday.
Rolando's wife and daughter both recovered, and now, every year, he pays for this blessing with his own flesh and blood, through self-flagellation and crucifixion.
I use what you call barbed wire for my crown of thorns. I use this material because it's durable and won't break easily. These are the kinds of nails I use. These are the nails that are driven into my hands.
It is Good Friday in the Philippines, the day that Jesus was crucified. The village of San Pedro Catude prepares for an estimated 10,000 visitors who will come to watch 15 crucifixions. Rolando's chosen to be crucified last, in hopes of avoiding the crowds.
This Purnell stuff? Okay,
With
thank you.
his nails, hammer, crown of thorns, and faith, the carpenter heads for the hill.
From the time I undress and I lie on the cross, it's like Christ takes over my body.
Each nail must be precisely placed. A miscalculation could cause permanent paralysis in the hands. The nails go through his hands and into the wood. After several minutes of agony, Rolando was lowered. Exhausted, his hands throbbing, he and his daughter returned home. It has cost him dearly, but Rolando has kept his promise. Within the hour, the wounds have begun to heal.
I could feel that the Lord has heard my prayers because my family and loved ones are no longer having troubles and are kept away from harm.
Rolando believes today's success means a brighter future for his family.
Excuse me, would you mind taking a picture of it?
There we go. Interesting. I thought obviously related to Holy Week, yes? Because this is the time when Christians remember the last week in the life of Jesus of Nazareth when he was arrested and crucified. What do you think? What do you think? Opinions? How do you think? Does it speak to you at all, or maybe not so much? Or kind of an extreme form of method acting, would you say, Ms. Fleming?
Yes, I understand like it's pretty fun, but me personally, I would just worship or like pray real hard.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not doing that, and I'm not trying to sound disrespectful, but like,
No, that's perfectly fine, you know. So, you know, I guess if you go to a Catholic church and they invite you to do the living stations of the cross, and the priest brings out the nails and the hammer. Yeah. A little bit extreme. I was in a living stations of the cross once. I played the Apostle John, so I was comforting the lady playing the Virgin Mary and stuff like that. But there was no actual crucifixion. I mean, we reenacted the crucifixion, but these people are hardcore, right, Mr. Watkins? Although I don't think they crucified, they didn't do a full crucifixion, but they didn't nail his feet, right? So you just nailed the hands. Interesting. What do you think? Go dismiss this Petrie.
I thought it was interesting that his hands healed within the next hour. Like the holes were a lot smaller and it wasn't like that destroyed.
Why is that interesting to you? Do you think it's like miraculous or something, or are you just okay, interesting? Like you're somehow protected from the wounds heal quick. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. I only know about this in the Philippines. I don't know if they do this in other cultures. I don't know how it developed specifically in the Filipino culture. It just did. I also don't know. I guess I should do some research. I'm curious how the local Catholic Church does it officially have a position on this practice. Obviously, it seems to be popular piety or devotion. I don't know if the church is officially approving of it. But that's something you come across in religions. People try to actually reenact something that happened in the life of a religious founder or a god, something like that. So it's not unusual to Christianity. No one thinks it's a little weird? No one has any objections to it? No. Yes.
I feel like if I were to get hammered in the hand, there's so much less.
Possibly. They did mention that there was there could be a medical problem with it. Do you remember what they said at the beginning? Not the beginning of the video, but before he was crucified. Yeah.
They said that if they didn't do it exactly right, it could cause full paralysis of the hands.
Yeah. I don't know how because I'm not a medical person. But yeah, I guess if you could hit a nerve or destroy a nerve or something. Yeah, so you're right. You could break bones, which is not a good thing. You paralyze the guy's hand if you do it wrong, so it has to be done the proper way. Probably not how the Romans actually did crucify. They probably crucified through the wrist and not so much through the hand, because there's more bone structure in the wrist and it gives the nail more stability, something like to grab onto. Also, there are a lot of nerves in that region, it makes it more painful. And they probably also tied the victim to the cross as well, not necessarily have to nail to the cross, but so they're not doing exactly the same way as the Romans would have done it, which, would have, right, Mr. Holzman, would have been very damaging, certainly to the bone structure of the wrist. Not coming back from that one. Alright, so I just thought it was interesting, and it ties into Passion Week, the week of Christ's suffering, or Jesus' suffering. See what some Christians do in religions. sometimes people can look at it and think it's a little bit weird, but, people do a lot of weird things that aren't necessarily religious. I mean, you go to a gym and you see people there who are throwing over huge tires from trucks, or they've got these, I see people with these huge ropes. I'm like, what did the rope do to you? What's wrong with the rope? Beating the rope on the floor over and over and over again. Or lifting these heavy weights that are tearing muscles in their arms, causing damage. Which is why they have these big protein drinks that they're drinking so they can rebuild the muscle damage. So people do this in other contexts, not necessarily religious. People harm themselves for a purpose, for a reason. In the case of, say, a gymnasium, people do it because they want bigger muscles. They want to impress people with their guns. Working on the guns, right? So they can wear their muscle shirts, or they can have six-packs abs. So they're trying to burn fat, destroy fat cells, decrease them. And you have people do religious exercises like stuff like this, which I'm not necessarily recommending. It's a little, as I said, it's a little bit too method acting for me. But there it is. Okay. So we're continuing to talk about Christianity. I was talking about one of the sources of authority for Christianity, part of the deposit of faith, sacred writings. Okay, so I was talking about the Bible. And I was just going to quickly tell you, what's in the Bible. Okay, like I told you what was in the Vedas. I'm not going to dwell on it too long, but I just thought you might be interested to know. You have two sections to the Bible. You have an Old Testament and a New Testament, which is added on later by Christians. The New Testament are the Christian writings. And the Old Testament has 4 sections to it. Remember, the Old Testament for Christians is kind of a library of writings. So you find all sorts of writings in it. They begin with, and you'll see some overlap with the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, but Christians organize it differently. They agree with, I guess the only point that the Christian Bible agrees with the Jewish Tanakh is having the Torah first. You have the Pentateuch, or the opening writings of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which we know from Judaism. And Christians generally call it the Pentateuch, which is a Greek word which simply means the 5 volumes. Pente means 5, tuchos means a hinge, like the hinge of a volume, a hinge on a book. So the 5 volumes, the Torah, as the written Torah, as Jews would call it. After the Pentateuch, you have a series of books which are kind of like histories. They tell the history of Israel, especially the history of the kings of Israel and how the kingdoms came about. And so those are called historical books. You have a bunch of books that are practical books that talk about how to live the Jewish life. And so they're concerned with wisdom. And as you see the definition there, what wisdom is specialized knowledge about ethical and practical pursuits related to human flourishing, things you're supposed to do to live the good life and stuff like that. And it addresses questions of life like suffering or what's the purpose of life, these kinds of questions. They're wisdom questions like philosophy. So they're more philosophical in nature. They also include poetry, praising God, songs, and things like that. So you have the wisdom books, which are practical, organized around practical knowledge. And then you have a whole bunch of books of prophets. A prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God, who tells you what God wants you to do. Okay, and the Jews were especially known for having a lot of prophets who would come to them and tell them God's will. Usually you did not want a prophet to appear because usually God wasn't happy with what the people were doing. So it was usually a negative message. It was not necessarily a message of hope. It was usually, God says you're doing this wrong, so shape up, So anyways. And remember, and again, this is another source of agreement with the Tanakh, because remember, there's a whole section in the Tanakh devoted to the writings of the prophets. Okay? And the same thing with the Christian Bible. They keep that division. The prophetic books of these prophets. Ms. Balser. Hey, Ms. Balser. One last point I want to make about the Christian Old Testament, because it's relevant and it's mentioned in the textbook, is this issue of the Septuagint. The Tanakh is written in Hebrew. I might have mentioned this before in Judaism, but if I didn't, I'll mention it now. It's written in the native language of the people of Israel, which was Hebrew, or at least ancient Hebrew, sometimes called biblical Hebrew by scholars. And but a lot of Jews, not every Jew lived in Palestine. Remember, the northern kingdom was destroyed and all the Jews were dispersed. So there were Jews all throughout the Mediterranean region and the major cities who were living there, and they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. In the synagogues, they still read their scriptures in Hebrew, but no one understood them. They had to be explained to them. But they still wanted to read their Bible, so eventually there was a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into the common language, which is Greek. And this translation is called the Septuagint, which is a Latin word, Septuaginta, which means 70. The number 70 in Latin. Setenta, if you speak Spanish, comes from the same word, Septuaginta. Septante in French. Okay, so the Septuagint, the 70. You might ask, well, why is it called 70? Well, because there's a legend associated with it that 70 rabbis were translating the Torah. And they all came up with the same translation in Greek. This is where this Bible came from, that the Septuagint was the Hebrew scriptures, or at least the Pentateuch, was translated by 70 rabbis or Jewish scholars into Greek, and when they compared their translations of the Bible, miracle of miracles, they were exactly the same of these 70 scholars. So that's the legend. I say it's a legend because it probably didn't happen. We don't know if it's just a story. But anyways, this was the common Greek Bible used by Jews and apparently used by Jesus and his apostles, his early followers. How do we know this? Because in their writings, whenever they quote from the Jewish scriptures, they almost always use the Septuagint. What makes it interesting for Christianity is that this was a period of development in Judaism, and there were more books in the Old Testament of the Septuagint than would later be accepted by the Jews. So as it turns out, the Old Testament that we have here of the Christians, some Christians, not all Christians, but for example, the Catholics, the Roman Catholics, and the Eastern Orthodox, not Protestants, but the Catholics and the Orthodox, to retain this ancient tradition, because of course they're ancient churches, they go back to the beginning. When Christians were using this Septuagint, so they include extra books that later on the Jews would not accept. When we got to the 1500s, and we had the Protestant Reformation, and our friend Martin Luther, who was Catholic, but he thought, and he was actually kind of wrong because he didn't know the history, but he assumed that the Jews got it right. They knew which books should be in their Bible. He didn't realize that actually Judaism decided later than the Christians. So actually Christians have a more ancient list of books than the Jews eventually accepted. And so he cut out these extra books that were in the Septuagint. He said, we'll only follow the Jewish Tanakh canon, which had lesser books, all in Hebrew. So this is what I want to mention about the Old Testament. You'll find in some Christian groups, like the Catholics and the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a longer Old Testament than you will later find in Protestant Old Testaments. But the New Testament is the same. There are no differences there. They contain the same books. And in the New Testament, in the Christian writings, there are 4 sections. The first section being the Gospels. What is a gospel? Well, this is what it is. It is a genre of Christian literature, and it only appears with Christianity. Before Christianity, there is no such thing as a gospel. And scholars still debate what exactly kind of genre it is, because it's kind of a biography, but it's kind of not. But anyways, it's a type of Christian literature that contains the details of Jesus of Nazareth's ministry and his teachings. His ministry and his teachings. Literally, the word gospel means good message or good news. It comes from 2 Greek words, eu, angelos. Okay, eu, use this in English too for Greek-based words. Euphony, which means good sounds. Euphoria, good feelings. Okay, and angelos, good message. Angel means message or messenger. So the good message about Jesus, or the good news about Jesus. So we have Gospels, and we have 4 of them. They're mentioned in the textbook, but I'll write them here. They're attributed to these 4 men: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And other than their names, we really don't know anything else about who they are. We just know that they're called, this is what they're called. These are the names. So there are 4 versions of the ministry of Jesus called the Gospels. There's one, the next section are letters, a bunch of early Christian letters passed around to different Christian communities. Most of them are written by Paul of Tarsus that I mentioned before, this rabbi named Paul who became a Christian. Then you have, and actually, in point of fact, the letters by Paul are earlier than the Gospels that were written down about Jesus. So that's interesting. Then you have one book that is a history called Acts of the Apostles, which attempts to be a kind of giving a little history of the early years of the Christian movement. And then finally, you have what is called, you okay?
Oh yeah, I just.
Oh, all right. You have a final book which is classified as apocalyptic literature. What is apocalyptic? Well, apocalyptic is a kind of symbolic literature focused on visions of the spirit world, the afterlife. Okay, and oftentimes apocalyptic literature has to do with the end of the world and stuff like that. Okay, so it might look into the future and stuff like that, but usually it's a commentary on things that are going on in the contemporary group. So there's Jewish apocalyptic literature, there's Christian apocalyptic literature. It wasn't unique to Christianity, but there's one book of apocalyptic literature called the Book of Revelation, or the Revelation of John, this man John. Okay, and it seems to be dealing with persecutions of the early Christian community by the Roman Empire and stuff like that, and killing off Christians and stuff. That seems to be what it's about, told through the symbols and visions of heaven and stuff like that. Anyways, so the apocalyptic. So that's what's in the New Testament. Actually, before I go on to that, there's more I want to say. Or is there more that I want to say? Yeah, I guess that's all I want to say. I just want to emphasize, because I might ask it on a quiz, just that, even though the Gospels come first and the Gospels are focused on the ministry of Jesus, especially the accounts of his death and then his rising from the dead, those are the 2 important points of the Gospels. They were not, as I said, they were not written first. So some of the letters of Paul of Tarsus probably, or almost certainly, predate the Gospels. Obviously, people were telling stories about Jesus before they wrote them down, but just, the actual writing down of the stories came later, even though the Gospels come first. So the letters section is probably the earliest part of the New Testament, or is the earliest part of the New Testament, I should say. Okay. So we have sacred writings, and we also have oral tradition, things passed on by word of mouth, called sacred tradition. So you have sacred scripture and you have sacred tradition. And again, Christianity comes out of Judaism. So you have the written Torah and you have the oral Torah. So the same idea, just different terminology for a different religion. Tradition comes from the Latin word trado, which means to hand on something, to pass on. So sacred tradition is the handing on of it can refer to anything that's passed along or handed on, any kind of customary belief or practice. But for Christianity, it's sacred tradition because it's the authoritative handing on of Jesus' message through the life and teaching of the community of the church. So sacred tradition for Christianity is the lived experience and their living of their beliefs in Jesus. Sacred tradition is not really written down anywhere. at least not in the beginning. It's, again, oral tradition. It's passed on orally, spoken by word of mouth. People tell stories about Jesus. They communicate their beliefs. You find this in every religion. And but there will be compilations later, and it includes especially writings of early church authorities called the Fathers of the Church, quote-unquote, the Fathers of the Church. It includes the leaders of the church, like bishops or overseers, the supervisors of the church. That. Where do Christians find this sacred tradition? Because, I mean, sacred writings are pretty easy. You look to the Bible. You look to the writings themselves. Sacred tradition is a little more fluid in any religion. But what are the common sources that we have? Remember, the oral Torah is written down in the Mishnah, and then it's further commented on in the Talmud. Okay, so you find the similar kind of process going on in other religions. So in Christianity, they don't have a Talmud or a Mishnah, but they do have sources for their sacred tradition as well. You look to the meetings of the leadership, bishops, so councils, which are meetings of the leaders of the Christian community to decide matters of teaching and discipline, what we are to believe and what we are to do about those beliefs. That's a source. Council comes from two Latin words, cum and callo, which means to call together. Another resource are the church fathers, as I told you, the fathers of the church. We know there were also mothers of the church, but women at that time didn't usually write stuff down. Sometimes women were educated, but not always, and so we know that there were mothers of the church, but we don't have any writings specifically from them. So it's mainly men. Oh, all right. And you have a definition. The period of the church fathers extends from the 1st century AD until around the 700s. 700s AD is the period that is generally given. And they're just Christian teachers and writers who are seen as authoritative interpreters of the church's beliefs. And so they're a resource for sacred tradition. Usually they're saintly men. They're not always recognized as saints, but they give a proper understanding of the faith. And a final resource for sacred tradition is the church's worship, how the church prays, how the church worships God. So liturgy, this word liturgy, which means my eyeglasses on, Laos and ergon, the work of the people. Laos means people and ergon work. So the people of work of the people, a public work, you might say. The church's public work is her worship of God. So as the church believes, so she prays. So just to give you an example we have from the church fathers, actually, from a man named Justin Martyr. He was a philosopher by trade, and then he became a Christian and was eventually killed for his faith. That's why he's called a martyr, Justin Martyr. He was in the 100s, so I'll say, I forget his exact dates. So 2nd century AD. Anyways, just, for example, he writes, he gives us our earliest description of the Lord, this Christian celebration of the Lord's Supper. I mean, we knew they were doing it before that, but he describes what Christians do. They come together and he says, we come together on Sundays, we read sacred writings and stuff like that, and, we pray to Jesus and stuff like that. And we take bread and wine, which is not considered normal bread and wine by us. God bless you. We say a blessing over it. We eat it and share it and stuff. Share it and eat it and stuff like that. So, that tells us something about, how the Christians worship. It tells us something about, what they believed. That they believed in sacred writings. They had special writings of their own. That they didn't believe that the bread and the wine, the food that they were eating during their worship service, was just normal bread and wine or food. That it had either some kind of spiritual significance to them. Yeah, so how the Christians would worship. We also, I don't think Justin Martyr says this, but we also have historical documents from non-Christian sources that talk about the Christians, singing hymns to Jesus as if he were a god and stuff like that. So that tells you something about Christian worship. It's part of sacred tradition. That obviously they were believing in Jesus, that Jesus was more than a man very early on, because they were worshiping him. They were singing to him in their worship services and stuff like that. Anyways, so that would be indicator. How the church believes, so she worships. All right. Yeah, I should mention that. So these are the two sources. These are the two parts of what we call the deposit of faith for Christianity. Again, now, I mentioned that there are different groups within Christianity, so we have to make a distinction here. For Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, whom I've mentioned, both of these go together. They're a single source. They all derive ultimately from Jesus of Nazareth. But when the Protestant Reformation happens, remember the principle I mentioned of sola scriptura. Scripture, the writings, are the only source of authority. So sacred tradition, for many, not all Protestant Christians, but a lot of the Reformers, sacred tradition is canceled out. It's not that they don't recognize that there are traditions, all right, that there are teachings passed on in the history of Christianity. It's that for the Reformers like Luther, they're not the ultimate authority. Only the sacred writings are, sola scriptura. So for the Protestant Reformers, Martin Luther, I mentioned John Calvin as well, sacred tradition is not authoritative or normative. So we have to kind of cross it out for a lot of the churches of the Reformation. Okay, we have to make that distinction. Okay. The idea of the Christ. We talked about this with Judaism, so I don't have to reinvent the wheel. But remember, Christianity comes out of Judaism, and the distinguishing feature about Christianity, why it's called Christianity, is because these Jews, part of the Jesus movement, came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ of Israel, which I talked about during Judaism. Hence, it's Christianity, and they are Christians, followers of the Christ, the Messiah. So we remember what the Messiah is. Just to recap, the Messiah is a descendant or a future descendant of King David who would come at the end of time to restore the kingdom of Israel, defeat her enemies, and establish a reign of peace based on the faithful observance of God's law. Okay, that's our definition from Judaism. Okay? So Christ is the translation of that word Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, if you recall, which means an anointed one. And that's exactly what the Greek word means. Chrio, and it means to rub with oil. So one who is anointed or rubbed with oil, it means the same thing as Messiah. It translates the Hebrew word Mashiach, meaning anointed one, or the Aramaic word Mashiach, to be more accurate. And I again tell you what the word anoint means. I think I did that with Judaism, so I won't mention that again. So, again, we know this idea of the Messiah, and it is applied to Jesus, who is called the Christ. Jesus the Christ. Remember, that's his title, not his last name. And we also talked about the fact in Judaism that there were several ideas of what the Messiah would be, until finally, Jews kind of decided this is actually what we're expecting. But during the time of Jesus, there were many ideas of what the Messiah would be: political ideas, spiritual ideas, apocalyptic ideas, and eschatological ideas, and end of the world kind of Messiah. And some Jews didn't believe in any kind of Messiah at all. They had no conception of a Messiah. No one seemed to think that there would be a suffering Messiah, though. Yes, sir.
There's something cut off in the picture.
Oh, whoops. Thank you, Mr. Holstein. Sorry about that. Whoops. Oh, I hate this. There. Put this down here. There we go. There we go. Okay. Just seeing, because I have crossover with my notes with Judaism, I just don't want to be repetitive. Okay. Yeah, so there was really, as we talked about with Judaism, maybe we didn't, but I'll mention it now. There really was no conception of a suffering Messiah, because remember, the King Messiah was not supposed to die. Remember, if you did the reading from Mishneh Torah by Maimonides, that was one of the problems he had with Jesus. He said, Messiah dies, we know that's not the Messiah. And Jesus died, so he wasn't the Messiah for Jews, for a lot of Jews. So that was, and so not a suffering Messiah, and certainly not a divine Messiah. Remember when we talked about Judaism believed in a supremely perfect God who is spiritual. He's not material, and he doesn't become part of the material world. So how would you explain God becoming a human being, becoming matter, and being born and growing up and having to eat and, whatever, walk around? So there was certainly not the conception that the Messiah would be a divine figure amongst Jews. And Jesus never comes out openly and clearly claims to be the Messiah, but he doesn't clearly reject the title either when it's applied to him either. Why would he do this? I mean, scholars have to surmise, because Jesus never explains, like, hey, I'm not going to call myself the Messiah, and here's why. It's like, no, he doesn't do that. I wish he did, but, so scholars have to kind of wonder, and maybe if we think, what seems plausible is that since there were many different and competing views of what the Messiah would be, and Jesus didn't see himself as any of those, or maybe he saw himself as parts of each one, but not completely each one. That's a possibility. But also, nothing will get you killed faster than coming out and saying, "Hey, I'm the King of the Jews, here to overthrow our enemies." So that might be another reason why Jesus might have wanted kept it very quiet, maybe for insiders, because it was a political bombshell. That he didn't want to ignite too soon. So, whatever. We have to surmise why Jesus of Nazareth might not have used this term, the Christ or Messiah, to describe himself, but his followers later would. We do know some peculiarities of how he did talk about himself, and the most common name that Jesus gave to himself, or title, was not the Christ, was this name called the Son of Man. It's an Aramaic phrase called Bar Anash. Bar means son in Aramaic, which is a language related to Hebrew. Anash means a human being, so son of the human being, or son of man. And it's the most common title Jesus gives to himself, even more than Son of God. He calls himself this 81 times throughout the four Gospels. And again, it's not entirely clear what the concept would have meant to Jews at the time, or what it meant to Jesus himself, which is kind of as you would expect. I mean, as historical figures are going along and doing things and saying things, they're not always thinking like, okay, people, man, 2,000 years from now, people are going to wonder what I mean by this. So, people just don't act or think that way. They're just going through their lives and doing things and reacting a lot of times. And Jesus was no different. So he wasn't going around giving definitions of what a Messiah was and what he thought a Messiah was, and the Son of Man and what he thought the Son of Man was. But he does call himself this a lot. And luckily, we have other Jewish sources which use this term Son of Man, so we can get an idea of what probably, or possibly, I should say, Jesus thought about this by using Bar Anash. And we want to look to the Jewish scriptures, to a book called the Book of Daniel, which is classified as apocalyptic literature. It's filled with all sorts of visions of things. And in chapter 7, this man Daniel has a vision of one, as he describes it, someone like a son of man. In chapter 7, he sees a vision of God, and then God sends out this figure, one like a son of man, who is going to defeat the enemies of the Jews. Okay. The book of Daniel was written down in Hebrew, but parts of it are in Aramaic. Was written down around the 100s BC, so within the century before the time of Jesus. So it's one of the later books of the Jewish Tanakh. And scholars wonder, does this mean an individual? One person? Does it mean a group? Is it meant to be symbolic of all of Israel? Like Israel would defeat her enemies? It's not clear. But traditionally, we do know that the rabbis and early Christians interpreted Daniel chapter 7 as referring to the Messiah. And we know this because we have Jewish literature like this thing called the Book of Enoch, which also was written just before the time of Jesus. It was written sometime between 300 to 100 BC. And in the Book of Enoch, which I give a selection from here, does anyone want to read that selection from the Book of Enoch? Anyone interested? Was that the name of a movie with Denzel Washington? Was that the Book of Enoch? No. Was it called the Book of Enoch with Denzel Washington? Or was it the Book of Elijah? I forget. Anyways, I'm always a big Denzel fan. Can watch anything he does. Yes, Mr. Irvin, go ahead, please.
And there was great joy amongst them, and they blessed and glorified and extolled, because the name of that Son of Man had been revealed unto them. And he sat on the throne of his glory, and the sum of judgment was given unto the Son of Man. Do you want me to keep going?
Yep, keep going.
All right. And he caused the sinners to pass away and be destroyed from off the face of the earth, and those who have led the world astray. With chains shall they be bound, and all their works vanish from the face of the earth. And from henceforth there shall be nothing corruptible, for that Son of Man has appeared, and has seated himself on the throne of his glory. And all evil shall pass away from his face, and the word of that Son of Man shall go forth and be strong before the Lord of Spirit.
Thank you, sir. So that's from the Book of Enoch, chapter 69. Two things to point out. The Son of Man will sit on a throne, so like a king, and also he will defeat the enemies of Israel, of the people of Israel. Okay, so we see the development of this idea of a Son of Man who is a messianic figure. Okay, already by the time of Jesus. So, interesting. Also notice that it's technically, or specifically what the phrase is in Daniel is one like a son of man. So you could also interpret it as it's not, because son of man means a human being in a way, a sabaranash, a son of a human being, but it's also like a son of man, so it's also not a purely human figure either. It's like a human figure, so it's something different going on there. Does this mean some kind of supernatural being, more than human? Don't know. But we do know that Jesus frequently applies this messianic title to himself. So although he doesn't come out and say, yes, I am the Christ, although he does on one or two occasions, more often than not, he's kind of hinting at it. And the fact that some of Jesus's actions, because as they say, actions speak louder than words, some of the things that Jesus did were certainly interpreted as claims to being the Messiah, and ultimately, as we might know, that's why he was crucified. The Romans could care less if Jesus was the Son of God or claiming to be a divine figure or something like that, or forgiving sins. They could care less about that. Pontius Pilate cared about, are you claiming to be a king? Which means that, you're placing yourself in opposition to the Roman emperor whom I represent. If you are, then that's treasonous, that's seditious, that's upending the social and political order, and that's a crime, and he would be executed. And that's precisely why Jesus was executed. The title of his crime, hanging over his head on the cross, was Jesus, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. Obviously not, because we crucified him, end of story, we dealt with him. So something Jesus was saying or doing certainly did get him into trouble in that realm, claiming to be the Messiah, that is. Oh, whoops. Yeah, I did this during Judaism, didn't I? Yeah, I thought I did this when I talked about the Messiah and the different kinds. So I put it here as well. I guess just to recap. Could have sworn that I did it with Judaism. Nothing. And no one was expecting a suffering Messiah. That was on nobody's radar screen. The Messiah wasn't supposed to die. Okay. What did Jesus teach? What are some of the main teachings of Christianity, or part of its beliefs? Obviously, Jesus was the Messiah, so that's a major belief for Christians. He's the fulfillment of that expectation of Judaism, and that's what I would say initially separates Christianity from Judaism in the Jesus movement. But what did Jesus teach? Well, here's an example of it. The greatest commandment. What's called the greatest commandment. Jesus is asked, what do you think is the summary of the law of Moses, of the Torah? What are we supposed to live by? And it kind of tells you, gives you an encapsulation of what Jesus's ethics is, his teachings are. And this, I'm giving this to you from the Gospel of Matthew, but you can find other versions in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke. Mark, scholars believe, was probably the earliest gospel to be written, so it's the earliest version of this, but I'll take it from Matthew. Matthew's more Jewish. And so what happens here? The Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, and they gathered together, the Pharisees, meaning, and one of them tested him. I want to see how smart he was, this woodworker from Nazareth. Asking him, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Okay? Which is the summary of the law. And Jesus says to this person, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. It's a very Jewish way of doing things. You ask for one thing and you get two. It's not a contradiction, okay? But it's a very common kind of even rabbinical way of answering questions. You say, what's the best of things? And then you give a whole list of things. You're looking for one, but you get a whole list. And so he asks actually for one commandment, but you get the greatest, but Jesus gives him two. Just for some little background, this is a controversy, part of a controversy story, because these are two groups called Pharisees and Sadducees that we knew were around the time of Jesus. And there's some historical reality here. There were different competing factions within Judaism at the time of Jesus. Pharisees were kind of like sticklers for the law. They were very strict and observant about the law. The Sadducees were usually the priests who operated in the temple when it existed. There are no Sadducees anymore because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, yes? So the priesthood died with that. And the Pharisees, some people see that the Pharisees actually are the kind of like the grandfathers of the rabbis of rabbinical Judaism in in the way that they are. They're passing on the traditions of the elders and stuff. So these groups are there at the time of Jesus. And Jesus seemed to have no time for the priests in the temple. Jesus went to the temple, worshipped there, but he didn't have a high opinion of the priests in the temple. So he had, the context of this is that he silences the Sadducees. He had a previous argument with them, and Jesus kind of like cuts them down. And the Pharisees like that because the Pharisees don't like the Sadducees very much either. And so they like that, they think Jesus is on our side, but they want to test him. They want to see, is he really on our side? So they give him this proposal of what's the greatest commandment. And Jesus gives this. So there are two commandments here. He draws on the first part of the commandment comes from which you might recognize from Judaism. Does anyone recognize the first part of the commandment? Love the Lord. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, blah, 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 blah. Bind it to your forehead, bind it to your arm, bind these teachings, write them on the doorposts of your home. Where does that come from? Yes, Mr. Holstein. The what? The Tanakh. It is from the Tanakh, sir. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6. But what is it called? Almost like the core of Jewish statement, the core of Jewish faith. Jews pray it like 3 times a day, pious Jews. Remember the tefillin, the little box of the leather box and straps that Jewish men will wrap around their arms and wrap around their heads, and it has this in there. What is it called? Written on a piece of paper. The mezuzah, Jews will write this on a piece of paper and put it on their doorposts. Hear, O Israel. Let's see. Yes, good. Look at your notes, Mr. Davy.
With the Shema?
Yes, the Shema. Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. From Shema in Hebrew means hear. Shema Yisrael. Let's see. Adonai Eloheinu, the Lord is our God. Adonai Echad, the Lord is one. The Lord is one. Should be interpreted, actually the Hebrew is ambiguous to be interpreted. The Lord is alone, the only God, or the Lord is ours alone, our only God that we worship. But the Shema, so Jesus is a Jew. He goes right to the heart of the matter. He quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6. The core of Jewish belief, the first thing is believing in the one God of Israel. But he adds something here. He adds from the book of Leviticus. So he quotes from Deuteronomy, but he adds from another part of the Torah this statement, which is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? But Jesus gives it his own twist. Okay, so we see here that Jesus draws on the Torah for the statement of the essential basis of his whole program. This is what he's about, love of God and love of neighbor. So he's not creating something new. He's not breaking with Judaism. He quotes directly from their scriptures. But again, he gives it his own twist, because if you look at Leviticus, I don't know if I put this on the PowerPoint. No, I did not. But if you look at the thing in the Jewish scriptures, neighbor was usually translated or interpreted as your Jewish neighbor, your fellow Israelite. So love your fellow Israelite as yourself. Not that, you hated everybody else or you could do bad things to non-Israelites. It just meant that you should have a special favor for your fellow Jew. But Jesus extends neighbor beyond the Jewish law to include not just an Israelite, but anyone. He redefines it so that it includes even an enemy, even someone who is really not very neighborly to you, one who hates or otherwise wishes harm on a follower of Christ. So this also by implication includes non-Jews, not explicitly, but it also becomes clear through Jesus' actions because he does interact at times with non-Jews, with Gentiles. Okay. I think this is part of the readings for Christianity that I put. It's on Canvas. There's a link to the Bible on Canvas, so you could just go on, follow the link. You don't need to own a Bible for the course. But I think I gave you the sermon I think I gave you Luke's sermon, which is shorter. Or did I give you both? I forget. But anyways, we have the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, in the Great Commandment, Jesus gives his basic expression of what he thinks is the obligation of his follower. And I guess for any Jew who followed him, or anyone who followed him, which is to love God above all things and to show that love to one's neighbor. But the Sermon on the Mount is a discourse that Jesus gives in two places, and the longest is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. And then there's a shorter version in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 6. And here we find the essential kind of battle plan for the kingdom of God. Let me just see if I have it here in my notes. And notes are a little bit discombobulated. Sacraments. Let me go forward, see if I have it here. No. Okie dokie. Flying without a net. And there you have a definition. It's Jesus' basic discourse or his basic statement on how his followers should behave towards God and other people. And it's famous because here Jesus lays out like specific commands about how his followers are to act towards God, how they're to pray, how they're to, and I think I give you Luke's part of Luke's shorter one, how they're to pray to God, how they're supposed to treat other people. So this is where you find love of enemies. He defines neighbor more as love of enemies, as well as those who love you. So do good to those who love you and those who don't love you. What else? Things about whatchamacallit. It's right there in front of me, but I can't grasp it. Hatred. He talks. Killing. Excuse me. The commandment on killing, don't kill people, but Jesus extends it to mean don't even hate other people or have negative feelings towards others, because hatred in your heart can be akin to killing. So things like that. So he gives a whole list of moral teachings in the Sermon on the Mount of specifically how his followers are supposed to live their life. And it's really the battle plan for the kingdom of God, because Jesus, that's the message of Jesus. That's his major symbol. He's coming to bring the kingdom of God. And he doesn't define it so much as he explains what it looks like. He tells stories about what it looks like. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives a sermon. He gives kind of he preaches a discourse about, okay, this is what the kingdom is going to look like. This is how you should live. Okay, it has to do with living and ethics, and the Christian followers should do these things. In the Sermon on the Mount, again, he's a Jew, so he appeals to the Jewish sacred writings, but he also gives them his own twist. I mean, obviously, if Jesus just repeated Judaism, then you wouldn't have another religion develop. You just have a sect within Judaism, maybe. And that's kind of how Christianity does develop. But Jesus also gives things, he has a uniqueness to his teachings. So he usually interiorizes the law. It's not so much as you follow the letter of the law, like, for example, it's not so much you follow the letter of the law, but also he focuses on intention. What is your intention in doing the law as well? So it might, the Ten Commandments say don't commit adultery. So you don't sleep with someone who's not your spouse. You don't violate that kind of sexual union, that sexual trust that exists between you and your spouse. But Jesus, again, interiorizes it and makes it about intention. It's not just the physical action that's adulterous, but even your heart. If you look at another person, a man or a woman, and treat them as a sexual object, you lust after them. Your intention is to, maybe physically you don't do something with them, but your intention is still to make them a form of sexual gratification. That's almost the same. So he interiorizes it and deepens the meaning of the commandment. So it's not just about following the rules and therefore you're righteous. It's also the context in which the person is following the rules. It's not enough just that you pray to God, but it's how you pray. Jesus recommends praying in secret where people don't see you. So, people aren't going to oh yeah, there's Mary. She's praying in church all the time, Isn't she a saint? Yeah. She may be a saint, but she also might be taking a nap. And people just likes the fact that people think she's a very holy person because she's in church all the time. She seems to be praying. It's not just the action, but the intention that Jesus emphasizes in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's important to giving us an idea. And here's a selection from the shorter of the two, which is Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. And I'll read this for you. Jesus says, "But to you who hear I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you." Okay? And that's kind of revolutionary in and of itself, because you don't want to actually, in common morality, you don't want to do those things. You don't want to give a blessing to someone who curses you or do good to someone who wants to mistreat you. You want to snap their neck before they do it to you. A preemptive strike, Mr. Watkins, You send the drones to drop a few bombs on this person before they can drop bombs on you. So what Jesus is saying is kind of counterintuitive. You don't want to love your enemies because your enemies wish you harm. But Jesus says to do the opposite. To the person who hits you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. And that was kind of an instance in the ancient world of shame. If someone hit you on your cheek, it wasn't so much that they hit you or struck you physically, but to hit a person on the cheek, slap them across the face, was to shame them in the community. Because in a lot of, if you ever take anthropology or even sociology, they might talk about this. But in a lot of cultures are based on these ideas of honor and shame. And ancient culture, Jewish culture, Greco-Roman culture was the same thing. So if a person, you have to be careful. You couldn't just joke around with people and make fun of them, because that could mean your death. Because if a person felt that his or well, in the case of women, but certainly in the case of men in the ancient world, if they felt that you had done harm to their reputation, the person would kill you. That was a very serious thing. So to shame a person by slapping them was something that would probably get you into a death fight. Maybe not at the time, but you would certainly have to do something to that person later if they caused you that kind of harm in the community. But Jesus says to ignore it, to forgive. In fact, offer them the other side of your cheek. From a person who takes your cloak, do not withhold even your tunic. Which is kind of an extreme statement, because your cloak was what you slept in. People didn't have beds like we have, beds and all sorts of sheets and what's what happens when you get old? You start losing things. Oh well. Blankets. That's what. Anyways. But they didn't have that. Your tunic was your blanket. That's what that you carried around with you. That's what you protected yourself from the elements. If it's raining or it's windy, that's also what you slept in. So if you're taking the person's bed away from them, Jesus says, "Well, go even further. Give them the clothes off your back, literally, your tunic. Don't resist them." Why? Because Jesus is speaking in the extreme, and there are scholars who debate whether Jesus actually meant these things literally to be done. Probably not, because then you'd see a lot of naked Christians walking around. And you don't see this even in the ancient church. But, as Jesus is speaking in an extreme way to show that, not caring about your physical possessions or even your reputation. What matters is your reputation with God and how you treat other people. Don't return, if someone shames you, don't return it with trying to shame them or trying to kill them over it. Not that it's not serious, that they might have harmed you, but that, your relationship with God is more important than that. So do to others as you would have them do to you. Which there's nothing necessarily religious about that, because you find that statement in other religions as well. Don't do evil things, don't do things to other people that you wouldn't want done to you, So if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Don't sinners do the same? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good things to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same, Bad people, even thieves help each other out, unless they're going to get nicked by the cops, then they might, grass on you. But anyways, but this is Jesus's argument, and this ties in to another aspect of the society, honor, shame, but also being kind of like a benefactor, that a gift exchange, and that if I do something good for you, then you owe me something good back. And you find this in a lot of cultures, especially old cultures, tribal cultures, that there isn't the sense of, if I give you a gift, it's a gift, right? Like in our culture, if I give you a gift, you usually expect, I'm not expecting something from you, right, Mr. Sullivan? It's a gift, right? If I just gave you a gift, would you expect me, I said, okay, give me $5, or do you think that's a gift?
It's more of a transaction.
Yeah, it's kind of like an economic thing going on, If I brought in the candy on St. Patrick's Day and I said, okay, now next class you all have to bring me something in return, because that's just. What? I thought he was just giving that to us. It was a gift. That's not how it is in a lot of cultures. Okay, there's a gift. It's very complicated. The whole thing of gift exchange. A gift is not without ties to it. If I give you a gift, then you owe me a gift in exchange, and usually that gift has to be more than I gave you. And you say, well, wait a second, doesn't that exponentially become crazy? Because then I, again, owe you in response to the gift you gave me more than you gave me. Yeah, it gets crazy. And, well, I shouldn't say that because I don't want to be judgmental on these other cultures, but yeah, it becomes a lot, okay? So it was no different in the time of Jesus in Greco-Roman culture, that if you gave people a gift, it tied you to them, they were bound to you in some way to owe you something in return. Right? It wasn't given freely. But Jesus says, and so that's what Jesus is kind of getting at here. If you just do good things to good people, what good is that? They owe you. Sinners do the same thing. They work by the same, people who are bad people work by the same principle. You're not doing anything, it's not costing you anything. In fact, you expect something to be given back to you. But rather love your enemies. He repeats his statement, in case they missed it the first time. Love your enemies and do good to them. Then your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High, meaning God. For God himself is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked. So again, be merciful as your Father God is merciful. So the example Jesus sets up is, how does God treat us? God is merciful to us even when we're not so good. He makes his rain to fall on both the good and the bad. So you should act in the same way. Okay. We are going to get to God, aren't we? After this. Church in some Okay. This one. Okay. All right, I want to talk about the councils because these are important for Christianity. There are 7 councils or meetings of the leaders of Christianity that are accepted by most Christians, and these councils kind of define the beliefs of Christianity. Most of these councils deal with Jesus. Most of them. And some of them are more important than others. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just so you're aware of them. The question that, really kind of engages Christianity for its first, 400 years, actually longer than that, say 600 years, is who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Christians knew he was the Christ, but what was his relationship to God? And so you have controversies over these questions, and you have to come up with different responses. So by the 4th century, the first council is the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where Christians have to decide on this question of what is Jesus' relationship to God, because very early on, Christianity understands Jesus as not just a human being, but also a divine being. And where that belief comes from, we don't know. We just know it develops very quickly amongst his followers, who were Jews. So it was really kind of odd that it would develop amongst them. But anyways, but they don't have it all figured out. They haven't figured out in what way Jesus is like this. And so you have a controversy develop in the early church by the 4th century. It kind of comes to a head. There's so much disagreement over it. Everyone agrees that Jesus is God. They also agree that Jesus is human. But the question is the main focus of the question is, how is Jesus God? Was he always God? Was he created God later on? Maybe when he rose from the dead? Stuff like that. So that's the question that's going to be addressed, because you have denials. You have people saying Jesus is God, but he wasn't God always. He was maybe created God at some period of time, probably maybe at the resurrection, but maybe before he was born, he was created by God in the supernatural. Maybe, okay? And this causes a lot of controversy. Now we have to, again, invoke our friend, in a manner of speaking, Constantine. Remember Constantine, who became emperor at this time, and a Christian, or at least a believer in Christianity. He wasn't baptized until he died. And he wants unity in the empire, and he actually travels to the eastern part of the empire and finds out that there's this great division over this question in Christianity. So he's the one who calls this first Council of Nicaea. He gets the bishops together and says, look, puts them in a room and decides, look, you guys figure this out, which they do. And so at Nicaea, in 325 AD, we have a statement where the church comes to the idea that Jesus has always been God. He wasn't created a God. He is, the phrase they use is, of one and the same being, or one and the same essence with God. It's, I'll give it to you because you might come across the term. He is homoousios. Homos in Greek means the same. Ousios means being or essence. I'll give you essence. He is of the same nature, you might say, as God. Okay, so Nicaea is an important council because you get your first actual definition or statement by Christianity that yes, Jesus is fully God. They kind of figure out what the relationship is. He's not a created God. He's not a lesser God than God the Father. Okay, we still believe in one God, but now Jesus, they have to answer this question: how is Jesus God? And they say, no, if he's God, and there's only one God, then there's only one essence to God. Okay, there aren't two or three or four. Yeah, go ahead.
Was there between these councils and like Vatican II that we talked about earlier?
Oh, Vatican II is a much later council. I'm focusing on the first 7 councils because these are the ones that generally all Christians agree on. Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. So let me make that clear. After this period of time, remember 787, remember in 1054, the East and the West split apart. Okay? And so you don't have any common councils after this, okay? The Western Church that you're mentioning, Vatican II, relates to the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church will continue after this to have other councils. In fact, they have, I think, 22 was the last. And Vatican II was in the 1960s, so that was the last universal council of at least the Catholic Church, but not of Christianity. And so those extra councils of the Roman Catholics are not accepted by the Orthodox, and then, of course, certainly not by the Protestants later on. So that's what you're referring to. Yeah, I'm just focusing on these kind of like common councils that would be accepted by all. Even some Protestants will accept these 7 councils. Okay. All right, well, I guess that's enough. I see my alarm's going off. So I'll stop there and come back to it on Tuesday next week. Remember, we don't have class on Thursday, so don't come to class. God bless you all as you celebrate Holy Week if you're Christian. If you're celebrating Holi if you're Hindu, or Ramadan if you're a Muslim, God bless you too. I hope you have a good celebration, and see you next week. You're welcome. You too, sir. Thank you.